Now, 3.5. Short and stubby though.
Have you ever gotten out on a body of water and looked at your spinnerbait box and just been completely blown away by the hundreds of different options, blade combinations, etc.? Well, today I'm here to talk about what you need to do, what blade combinations you should look for, given the conditions that you're going to be fishing, and some of the things that I wish people would have told me before I started fishing a spinnerbait about spinnerbait fishing. Real quick, guys, if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button to follow along with my regular content coming out every Tuesday and Thursday at 7 p.m. But without further ado, let's get into it. The next thing that I want to talk about is going to be the blade combinations. That is the bread and butter of spinnerbait fishing, and that is the biggest thing that I wish somebody would have told me, is what the different blade combinations do and when to throw them, right? So we're going to start with cold water and work our way year round. And the first thing that I'm going to start with is you have a single Colorado blade. And what does that single Colorado blade do? That single Colorado blade adds a lot of thump, and that is going to put the most vibration out there. That's going to be the heaviest thump. It's really going to slow that bait down. This is what you use in cold water. This is what you use in dirty water. Basically, when that water is in a position where you want to give that bait a lot of time to soak in front of those fish. So that bait goes really, really slow, puts out a really, really loud thump, and it just crawls across the bottom. This is not a bait you want to burn for. This is not a bait I'm going to use for smallmouth particularly. This is pretty much my largemouth only, dirty and cold water. Something where I want those fish to be able to feel that bait coming from a ways away and just be able to detect where it's at. That's what a Colorado blade is for. Now you can get into double Colorado blades and whatnot. It all does the same thing. Those Colorado blades, the bigger and rounder the blade is, the more vibration it's going to put out there. The next one that I want to talk about is, we're just going to keep working around, is an Indiana blade. And the difference between a Colorado and an Indiana blade is a Colorado blade basically is almost a circle. If you look at that, that is a Colorado blade, pretty much a circle. If you look at an Indiana blade, it is more oblong, right? It looks kind of like an oval for the most part. It does a very, very similar thing. It is kind of that in-between stage. It's where you want to put out some thump, but you really don't want to slow it down as much. It's really, really good for when there's a lot of wind, you have really rough conditions, something where you really want to give those fish a chance to find that bait, but you still want to move it. That's what an Indiana blade is for. You can kind of get away with fishing it fast and also fishing it slow. It just depends on the conditions you have ultimately. If you're fishing more in the summertime, but where you have dingy water but you still want to move it, that's where I'm going to go with that Indiana blade. That's going to cover you pretty well. If you have a cold front in a warming trend, that Indiana blade, it's going to put out more thump, but it's also going to allow you to keep fishing it fast. And like I said, those fish are going to tell you what they want, but that Indiana blade is just kind of an in-between between a willow leaf, which we're going to talk about next, and a Colorado, which we just talked about. So keeping that in mind, we're going to move forward to our willow leaf, which is kind of everybody's favorite. Everybody, when you see throwing a spinnerbait, this is the blade that everybody throws, We're going to start with big willow leaves. That is these babies right here. You can see they look like the leaf of a willow tree. They are just like kind of that pointed, elongated shape. And that is the stereotypical blade. And it covers you in most situations. Most situations, that willow leaf really, really does a good job of imitating bait fish. And that's ultimately what a spinnerbait does for the most part, right? It just imitates the bait that is out there. So this one I reach for when I'm post-spawn. Those fish are off the bed and they're out feeding. I'm going to go to this one. I'm going to go to this one for smallmouth. This is pretty much my smallmouth only bait. If I'm going to throw a spinnerbait for smallmouth, this is going to be the one that I'm going to throw. This is the ideal bait because the thinner those blades are, the faster I can move that bait. And you can see they come in different sizes here. We have bigger willow leaves and smaller willow leaves. The bigger the willow leaf, the more thump it's going to put out, and the slower that bait's going to go. So the smaller the willow leaves, like if you were throwing something like this, versus this, you can see the blade difference. I can burn this bait where this one still has to be fished a little slower, but it is the fastest of the heavier spinnerbaits. So keeping that in mind, this is what I'm going to go to when it's summertime and I get a little bit of wind. That's what I'm going to throw this one. If that water's dirty in the summertime, I still might throw this one. If I'm fishing in Florida pretty much year round, I'm going to throw this one. It is just a go-to bait when that water is warm, when those fish are active and those fish are chasing bait. That's when I'm going to go to that willow leaf. It is also the bait that I'm going to go to when I want to fish a spinnerbait deep. A lot of times it's hard to fish a Colorado and Indiana blade deep because of how much thump the bait puts out there, the blade, because it makes that bait rise up. And that is one thing I really wish somebody would have told me, is the bigger those blades, the more lift they have. So a lot of times you think, okay, I put on a willow leaf, but if you put on like a size 6 willow leaf, one of these great big ones, it's still going to have a lot of lift, and you're not going to be able to fish that bait as deep as you would like to. And that's what's important to note, is the smaller the blade you go, the deeper you can fish it. So sometimes if you're wanting to fish a willow leaf spinnerbait deep, you have to downsize your blades. You might put an ounce spinnerbait on, but if you got these giant sails on here, it's going to make that bait rise up as you're trying to fish it through that deep water. So one of the last couple blade combinations that I want to talk about is one by Megabass. They have come out with this one that is kind of an in-between Indiana and willow leaf, almost just like a fatter willow leaf. And it's more of a finesse spinnerbait because it has a super thin wire on it. But what that does is that puts out a little bit more thump, and I like to throw this when I'm fishing a willow leaf and all of a sudden things get pressured. You know, like if I get into a situation where I've been catching them on a willow leaf, because what this does is it slows that bait down a lot. So if I'm fishing an area with a willow leaf and all of a sudden the water gets a little bit dirtier or anything like that, that's when I'm going to go to something that has that little bit bigger blade, because like I said, it puts out a little bit more vibration. I also want to talk about these finesse willow leaves because, like I said earlier, it allows you to burn that bait extremely, extremely well, and it's a super compact profile of these small spinnerbaits. So this is another one that I will go to if I've been catching them on a full-size spinnerbait like this, and all of a sudden the bite gets tough. That's when I'm just going to downsize my bait because it puts out less vibration as far as what the blades are doing. But if you also look at the diameter of that wire, you can see this full-size spinnerbait, the wire is a lot heavier. So it was relying all on the blade, versus now I'm going to be throwing this finesse one that's going to have a lot more rock and a lot more roll to it, and that's just going to allow you to get more bites, and it's kind of a vibration that they haven't seen. Same thing goes when I'm throwing Little Indiana with a Colorado on there. This is a bait that I'm going to use when I'm fishing around grass, when I'm fishing dingy water, when I'm in a situation where those fish have been pressured. You know, you see the Elite Series guys do it on places like the Red River, the Sabine River, those fisheries that are really, really tough where the conditions call for a spinnerbait, but the fish are smaller. Say you're in a situation where you're on like the Ohio River, where the situation calls for spinnerbait, you have a little bit dirtier water, you have current, you have bait. I will go to this because the fish that you're fishing for are actually smaller. So just taking your spinnerbaits and downsizing them to this as opposed to these full-size ones like this. If I'm fishing in a fishery where 12 pounds is a sack, just take your spinnerbaits and just downsize them a little bit. Go to a little bit smaller, because what you're still going to do is instead of catching 12 inchers, you're going to catch 14 and 15 inchers. You know, you might even catch 2.5 pounders. You know, versus if I'm on a fishery where they're smashing them and 5 pounder's a big one, then I'll throw that full-size bait because I'm not afraid to throw it around those bigger fish because they don't feel as threatened by this as smaller fish do. Smaller fish see this, and a lot of times they avoid that big bait. So just keeping that in mind and downsizing your spinnerbaits can get you a ton more bites. Now, one of the biggest things that people overlook when they're looking at a spinnerbait is the wire. The wire that you're actually fishing is more critical than pretty much the rest of the spinnerbait, because one thing to note is the thicker the wire, the more it restricts the vibration of the bait. You know, it holds it stiffer in one place, and it doesn't allow it to rock, and it doesn't give those blades the thump that they really, really need. So one thing to pay attention to is the thickness of that wire. The thinner the wire, the more vibration it's going to put out there, and the better that spinnerbait is actually going to fish. Now, if I'm fishing clear water, that's when I want thinner wire because it's going to put out more vibration, versus if I'm fishing dirty water, it really isn't as big of an issue for me because I'm relying more on that blade than I am the entire spinnerbait profile. And that's kind of backwards to what you might think, but just keeping that in mind, you also have to pay attention to the thinner the wire, the easier they break, and you have to pay attention to that because you might catch 6 or 7 fish, and the more they bend and straighten the blades out, because they will bend this wide open when they eat it, it's really going to weaken that bend right there, and you're going to have to change that out and pay attention to that. So I generally will go like 10, 12 fish, and then I'm going to change that spinnerbait before I have a catastrophic failure, because it does happen. And when I'm fishing a spinnerbait, there's an easy way to make it do what you want. So you can kind of fish one spinnerbait depending on how deep you're fishing, obviously. But one of the biggest tips to note is if I take this arm and I bend it up, that's going to make that spinnerbait swim slower, because you're now pushing all of this water as opposed to all of this water. You see what I'm doing there? All of this water versus all of this water. So if I want to fish it faster, I will take and pinch this and bend this down to where that arm is tighter to the body because it becomes a more compact profile. Versus if I want to slow it down, I will take and bend that up because that'll slow that bait down. So that is one tip I really wish somebody would have told me, because you can get away throwing one spinnerbait almost the entire day. If I were to be throwing this big spinnerbait and all of a sudden I hit a pocket where that water's a little bit dirtier, just take and bend that up, because now I can get that to ride over top of limbs, over top of laydowns, up super shallow. Whereas all of a sudden that water gets a little clearer, the water warms up throughout the day. I can take and I can bend that puppy down, and now you can see how much more compact that is. And they're still going to be able to get that hook, but it's going to be a little bit faster moving bait because I can get it deeper and it's more compact. One other thing to note is if you look at how these baits come standard out of the package, if you look at where the hook point is to the blade orientation, it's important that you don't have this blade overhanging too much. Because if this blade is overhanging too much, then it becomes the weakest link in this little bait ball, which is essentially what a spinnerbait is, right? So if I have this blade positioned down here, that's what those fish are going to want to slap at first. So what I will do is I will take, you can see there's all this slop in this arm right here with this on it. I will actually move this up, cut this, and re-bend it with this blade on there. And you can see I've done that once to this already. I typically like to have the middle of this blade even with my hook point. What that does is that gives me the best hookup ratio, where if a fish does slap at that blade, it's still going to get the hook point. But it also makes this skirted material down here where the hook is the weakest looking link in a spinnerbait. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the conditions you're going to throw a spinnerbait in. A spinnerbait is a super phenomenal big bass tool, and it is probably one of the OG big bass baits out there on the market today, and it flat out does. It just catches bigger fish. If you ever watch any of Rick Clunn's videos or Patrick Walters on Bass University, they talk about how it catches giant bass. And it's true. It does. All the vibration that those blades put out there just attracts big bass. So the conditions that you look for kind of differ based on what you're fishing. If you're fishing open water, you want a little ripple on the water. That's really going to allow those fish to not get as good of a look at it, and they're going to eat it a lot better. Versus if you're fishing around grass, it really doesn't matter a whole lot. You can get away with fishing it in the sun because a lot of times it pops into their face and it's more of a reaction bite. They feel it coming, but they can't see it until it's right there. But overcast and rain and a little bit of wind is generally what I'm looking for. Now you can get away with throwing a spinnerbait in other conditions and it will catch fish, but a lot of times what you have happen is they get the very edge of the hook. They're not getting the bait really well. How they get the bait is going to determine whether I change colors or just go to something different. And that's what you really have to be paying attention for, because some days you'll be out there throwing a spinnerbait in the perfect conditions, but they're going to be just nipping at it. And fish don't read books, so you kind of have to just adapt to what the fish are telling you to do. If you don't have the right rod and reel for spinnerbait fishing, you're going to be left out in the dark and you're going to lose a lot of fish. So the rod that I throw my spinnerbaits on is the same one that I throw my chatterbaits on. It's an ARC Invoker Pro series. It's a 7.4. It's a medium heavy moderate action. So it has a soft tip but heavy backbone. And what that allows for is when those fish come up, a lot of times they push that bait and try to suck it in before they actually get it. If you're smallmouth fishing, they just hit it like a brick. But for largemouth and spotted bass guys, a lot of times they try to use that force of their mouth suction to suck that bait in before they really turn with it. And if you have too stiff of a rod, you can pull it right out of your mouth. Same thing with smallmouth. If you have too stiff of a rod, you're just going to pull that hook right out of their mouth. And that's why I like this Invoker Pro, because it has that soft tip and it allows me to have some cushion on there before I really lean into those fish. So you'll start to feel it load up and then you hit them. So it makes for a lot better hookup ratio and you land a lot more fish. And the reel that I pair that with is basically any Shimano series reel. I'm a big Shimano guy. I'm not sponsored by them or anything like that. I just really like their reels. But I like a 7:2-to-1 gear ratio reel. Now, for some of the other baits that we're going to talk about today, as far as different spinnerbaits, you might want to go to an 8:2-to-1 if you're in certain situations. But for the majority of the time, I like a 6:3-to-1 to a 7:2-to-1 gear ratio reel. That is going to be my bread and butter, and that is what's really going to help me through. Line size is all dictated by where you're fishing, but 14-pound is usually a good go-to. Now the last thing that I want to talk about is a little bit about the trailers. You can see I have a Z-Man diesel minnow on right here, and I love the Z-Man lineup for the sole fact that with a spinnerbait, the trailer is not the primary goal here, right? The the trailer is just an add-on that adds a little bit of action and does a couple different things. So if I can put one trailer on and use it all day, which I can with these Z-Man products, that is going to be your bread and butter, because now I don't have to waste time changing trailers out where they rip the tail off, a perch bites it, anything dumb like that. So there's really two different types of trailers that I'm going to have. I'm going to have straight tail trailers, and I'm going to have swim bait trailers. And the difference between the two is a straight tail trailer allows me to fish that bait deeper because there's less kick, whereas a swim bait trailer allows that bait to have a little bit more action, which keeps that bait up in the column. You know, it adds more thump, kind of like adding a bigger blade on there. What that's going to do is that's going to make that bait ride even higher. So being aware of the trailer that you put on there can also change the action of your bait, and that is a huge, huge tip that I wish somebody would have told me, because you can also throw one spinnerbait again. If I decide I wanted to get this Megabass V2 a little bit deeper, all I'd have to do is put a straight tail trailer on there, like a twin tail or a split tail grub on there, and all of a sudden I'm going to be getting a couple more feet out of this bait. Versus if I'm fishing deeper and I want to get it shallower, I can now put a swim bait on there, and I can go from a diesel minnow to like a Kitech Fat Swing Impact, which has a really big wide kick that we all know and love. And you know, it's going to completely make that bait ride so much higher. So if you guys like this content, be sure to check out this video where I talk about what I wish somebody would have told me about fishing a swim bait. Same thing applies, but it takes all of the information that I talk about with a swim bait and that I wish everybody would have told me, and I downsized into that presentation, because a swim bait goes extremely well with a spinnerbait when conditions change, and that is something that I would pray that you guys want to know more about, because it is a super awesome tool in a fisherman's arsenal. Swim bait is probably one of the greatest baits ever invented as far as imitating bait fish. But thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button to follow along with the content coming out every Tuesday and Thursday at 7 p.m. But until then, God bless y'all. Thank you guys so much for following along, and I hope to see you guys out there on the water.